Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on stakeholder perspectives on an Australia-UK FTA, services, innovation, and our shared digital future. My name is Gabriel Gari, and I'm a reader in international economic law at Queen Mary, University of London. This webinar is co-hosted by the Institute for International Trade, the University of Adelaide, Queen Mary, University of London, the Australian Services Roundtable, TheCity UK, and UK Professional and Business Services Council. It is being live streamed and recorded. On the 15th of June, Prime Ministers Scott Morrison and Boris Johnson announced a historic trade agreement between Australia and the United Kingdom. On the 21st of June, we organized a first seminar to discuss its implications for the services industry. We were privileged to have Elizabeth Bowes, Chief Negotiator from the Australian Government's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Peter Harrington, Head of Economic Diplomacy, British High Commission in Canberra, who presented some of the key negotiating outcomes of the agreement. And we also had reactions from Australian services industry representatives. This webinar has been recorded and it's available in the Institute for International Trade website. And I encourage you to watch it, as it's going to be an important basis of what we're going to discuss today. The details of the agreement in principle that have been released to the public so far are very encouraging, although there is some way to go until the agreement is signed and the negotiating package includes ambitious commitments in services, investment, mobility of persons, as well as advanced disciplines on digital trade and a chapter on trade and innovation that is a first of its kind. The stakes are high for both parties. For Australia, this agreement sets an important precedent for its ongoing negotiations with the EU. And for the UK, it's the first fully fledged agreement concluded in full command of its trade policy after leaving the EU. It sends a strong message about the type of agreements the UK is after and constitutes a significant step in its goal to join the CPTPP. The services industry has high expectations on this agreement. As someone who works in the higher education sector, I too share the enthusiasm for the opportunities that it creates for further developed relationship between Australian and UK universities. In fact, the University of Adelaide and Queen Mary are already working on research and executive training, and including a forthcoming program of global business strategies in a post-Brexit world. Today, we are fortunate for having with us yet again two government officials which have been directly involved in the negotiations and will give us a further insight into the key milestones achieved by the agreement. We are grateful for their time and we deeply appreciate their commitment to bring transparency to the trade negotiations. We will have the reactions from 6 representatives from Australian and British services industries, and time permitting, I will ask government officials to respond to any particular issue raised by services stakeholders. We have just under 60 minutes to hear from 8 speakers, so in the interest of time, we will not have a Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, let me introduce the trade negotiators. Ben Rake is the Deputy Head of the Trading Services team in the Department for International Trade, where his responsibilities include leading the UK-Australia services negotiations. Ben has previously worked on a number of FTAs, including the UK Trade Continuity Agreements, UK-Japan, UK-Korea, and UK-EEA. He has experience of bilateral, multilateral, and EU trade policy, starting his trade career working on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between the EU and the US, and has served as the UK delegate to the European Council Trading Services Committee. Stephen Dietz is a career diplomat serving as First Secretary Trade at the Australia High Commission in London, where he leads on the bilateral trade relationship. Since joining the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in 2009, He has served in Australian mission to the WTO and in Canberra as a trade lawyer and negotiator. Stephen has also held appointments as associate to the Honourable Justice John Dowsett, AMQC at the Federal Court of Australia, and as a congressional fellow to US Senator Bob Casey. Stephen holds degrees from Bond University, the Australian National University, and Columbia Law School, where he was a John Monash Scholar. So let's start with Ben, please. The floor is yours, Ben.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for their time today. I will do my best to give an outline of where we've got to, and if there's a chance, I'll try to respond to any questions or issues raised at the end. But I do understand there's a time issue. So we have this AIP. What on earth does that mean? In this scenario, it's a reflection of where the trade negotiators, of which I am one, have got to, as at the point the trade negotiation was signed. And this was, as I'm sure many will be aware, was something that was also thrashed out by the two prime ministers in and around the G7 event in Cornwall recently. It's an interesting experience for me, as Gabriel noted, as someone that started as a delegate to the European Council Committee. I remember when the EU-Australia negotiations were first commencing. So it's a nice experience to have got this far with the UK independent agreement with Australia, and a country with whom we have so many close ties and shared relationships, both business but also people to people, I think is the phrase we like to use. So I do services. I've been leading the services package, mainly focusing on the services and related annexes, the services chapter, and also on business mobility, but I'll do my best to pick up some other elements as well that might be of interest. As Gabriel mentioned, this is the first one that we've done fully, I think, as an independent trading nation after we left the EU. Although obviously others will note the EEA agreement as well, which has been recently announced. But I think this is a real opportunity for the UK to really, and Australia, to put a marker down for what UK trade policy can look like going forward with such a like-minded country. So with that, there is also a huge opportunity for services. I won't touch on the wider negotiation dynamics, and our chief negotiators will talk about the need for balance across the agreement. That won't surprise anyone, but the services package, I think, for both sides, and Stephen will come in and talk about this in a minute, but the services package for both sides is a major opportunity, I think, to show what can be done for services trade in an FTA. And we have been doing our best to deliver an outcome that reflects that ambition. And we will continue to do so. So, with that said, we have this AIP document. So it sets out the broad parameters of where we are in the negotiation. It is relatively detailed and covers most of the main provisions that we've been haggling over with our Australian counterparts over the last year or so. So it's fairly comprehensive in that sense. What it is not is a legal treaty. So those of you who have had a chance to have a look will note that it is, for services, a page or two of text and bullets. My job now with my counterparts is to make sure that we close that down into a legal treaty, which we have been working on. This is a summary of where we've got to. Related, we will also need to look at, we are currently looking at the market access schedules as well, which will also determine the respective access and certainty that we have to each other's markets. Very briefly, I think this will be a highly liberal trade and services agreement. It will cover central and regional levels of government. It will use a negative list style agreement, which we think is the most modern and liberalising form. It's also the form used in TPP, and for UK stakeholders, it's what we've done with CETA and with Japan. We're both expecting this to be the best market access offers that we've that we come out with for either side. So it should be at the top end of ambition. Within individual provisions, there'll be sections on professional services where we'll be looking to make it easier, streamline processes and have provisions to support the recognition of professional qualifications in time, without prejudicing, obviously, the decisions made by regulatory bodies, but we'll see strong provisions for professional services, particularly legal services. We'll also see provisions for UK Australia flagged vessels, which people will be familiar with from the UK agreements in Japan, but I think is new for Australia. So there'll be strong provisions for maritime as well as express delivery, which I think is important. Business mobility, the services sector is really important, but a lot of the companies in the professional services sector, which I know we've got a number of on the line today, will be advising clients all over the world doing a range of things. And I think at this time, global value chains, supply chains have not been, have really been more important. So I think strong provisions on maritime shipping and express delivery will be critical here too. We'll also be looking for those of you who follow the WTO negotiations, strong outcomes on domestic regulation, which sounds a bit dry, frankly, but it is the nuts and bolts of services trade. It's about how quickly or how easily you can get a authorization to supply a service or a license, or the processes around qualifications. Really, really important, and we should do something ambitious with Australia, and that's what we're negotiating now. I want to touch on, we've also got a direct financial services chapter, a financial services regulatory cooperation annex, which I think is really important for the relationship with Australia, especially given the strong links through the fintech bridge and things like that already. Chapter on telecommunications and investment. I won't touch on that, but I can try to pick up things if people want to at the end, but we're looking at top end investment chapter. Although noting just for interest that the investment chapter will not include investor-state dispute settlement. There'll also be strong digital trade chapter. Finally, the thing I did just want to touch on, which was why I was racing through that slightly, so apologies, is on mobility, because I think this is a particularly important area. We have done extensive stakeholder engagement. Hopefully many of the people that we've been speaking to over the last few years are on this call. There's a clear message that mobility, and particularly business mobility, is an important outcome for this agreement. We're negotiating a strong package here, and you'll note from the AIP things like waiving of economics needs test on a reciprocal basis in business mobility categories, and ensuring that we're making binding commitments to each other on those categories related to business where our professionals can move back and forth. I think is a really important outcome in giving certainty to businesses, and will cement those relationships, of which, especially for the services sector, people moving is particularly important. After COVID, I should add, please stay at home. Finally, I would just touch on, we're also looking at wider initiatives that go just beyond business mobility, and you will have noted from the AIP document, I think some really exciting provisions around youth mobility, which will, again, further support the relationship between our two countries. And that takes us slightly beyond the normal trade space, but I think an exciting place to be in for an FTA with two countries like ours. I'll stop there. I think I'm probably busting the time limit, so apologies, but I hope it's helpful. I was just going to say one final thing. There is still work to do. We will try to keep you posted as much as we can. I really, really welcome the opportunity to be transparent about what's going on and to talk with stakeholders about what's happening. So thank you for the opportunity. As I say, lots of work to do. And then when the deal is signed, there will be lots of implementation work to do, which is, as anyone who's been around trade policy for a while, definitely the most important bit.
Oh, thank you, thank you very much, Ben. Indeed, we, as I said at the beginning, we do appreciate the commitment to transparency of the negotiations, and we value your presence today. And of course, as you outlined, is quite ambitious. We have a lot. You will have to get into details, but it's quite promising. So, without further ado, I pass on the floor to Stephen. If you can give your views, please.
Thanks so much, Gabrielle, and thank you to the organisers of the event for bringing us all together, especially in the wake of such a momentous outcome in the announcement of AIP. It's great to be seeking, spreading information and seeking kind of feedback from our stakeholders on what's been announced. I'm not a negotiator myself, but have been based at the High Commission since mid-2018 and have been working on the FTA since that time in our initial scoping discussions leading to the launch around June last year and agreement in principle this year. It's been frankly quite thrilling to see the evolution of the agreement from those initial stages, and I know a number of other people on this call have also been involved for that long, so I'm sure they've enjoyed that as well. I'd agree with a lot of things that Ben has said. I mean, certainly from Australia's perspective, the announcement of AIP on the 15th of June was a fantastic outcome. As Ben said, it's the AIP itself does not conclude negotiations, but sets a framework for what will actually be Australia's most ambitious FTA with any country, putting aside our relationship with New Zealand. And really what this is about is, creating new opportunities and jobs for our businesses and our people with quite a large scope. There won't be time in this session to cover off on everything, and I'll also try not to repeat the issues that Ben's touched on, but most of which I would agree with in the points that he made on mutual recognition in professional services, including the legal services, express delivery, maritime, DomReg, financial services, and particularly mobility as well. That's one area where like the agreement in the broad, but in the specific area where this will be one of Australia's highest ambition packages. And so in addition to those points that Ben mentioned with respect to commitments within the FTA and on labour market testing, for example, and the initiatives that were announced on youth mobility, we are continuing to work with the UK on other areas, although that work is not finished, including plans for an innovation and early career exchange program, and establishing mobility opportunities for people to work in agriculture as well. So there is a number of ways in which this agreement is fleshing out opportunities in response to interest that we've had from stakeholders, particularly on the mobility package. I think having spoken to many stakeholders in the UK over the past few years, mobility is a key area where they were hoping to see some outcomes, and we hope that they're pleased with what's been announced so far. I'll touch on investment because I know Ben didn't have time to. From looking at the AIP, we can say the FTA should include the most comprehensive investment rules Australia's agreed with any partner, including best-in-class protections for investors, together with modern safeguards to ensure the right of each government to regulate is preserved, obviously key, as well as a most favoured nation provision to guarantee that Australia's investors access to the UK market will remain the best available, and vice versa. As Ben said, the agreement won't include an ISDS mechanism. But as part of the AIP, we announced that Australia will be encouraging further UK investment via the raising of the monetary threshold for UK investments requiring Foreign Investment Review Board screening. And in addition to mobility, this is one area where we receive frequent requests by stakeholders to facilitate further investment via this FTA. Of course, as part of this, we will be maintaining the right to screen to safeguard in the national interest and national security, but it's certainly a positive step. The FTA will also cover both FTI and portfolio investment, unlike the existing FTAs to which the UK is a party, like UK-Japan and the UK-EU TCA. So that's something that will benefit Australia's world-leading asset management sector. And similarly, Ben mentioned on services, the FTA will take a liberalising and transparent approach available to market access by listing restrictions on foreign investment at both central and regional levels. So fantastic outcome on investment as well, something that should be of interest to many of the people on this call. I'll also touch briefly on digital trade, one of the other areas I don't think Ben got quite enough time to. So Australia's approach to digital trade rules in FTAs, including the Australia-UK FTA, is based on non-discrimination, technological neutrality, and interoperability. And we aim to future-proof our FTA commitments in this highly evolving space. So under this FTA, we've secured ambitious commitments to increase opportunities for digital trade across all sectors, including financial services. We have committed with the UK to enabling cross-border data flows and avoiding unjustified data localization, ensuring that business has the flexibility to move and store data across borders, and enabling consumers to access various digital services from anywhere in the world. And importantly, these rules ensure appropriate protections for consumers and for legitimate public policy objectives. We're also reducing barriers for business in digital trade by facilitating acceptance of electronic versions of trade administration documents, contracts, and signatures. And businesses, including SMEs, will be protected from forced tech transfer of their products' source code, subject to some exceptions. Cooperation is an important part of our shared digital agenda. And so, for example, we're looking to establish interoperable e-invoicing and digital identity frameworks, and on important issues like data innovation, emerging technology, and digital standards. That cooperation piece is particularly important. And that picks up, I think, on a point that Ben made with respect to financial services or financial regulatory cooperation as well, that this is, in some senses, a living agreement that we want to make sure is responds to developments over time. One further point I'll make, and then I'll wrap up, which comes back to the process we're now going through in terms of negotiating our market access schedules. We have commenced this process, which will give effect to the level of ambition that we agreed in the AIP, a highly liberal approach across services sectors. And to this end, we are interested in your further input. Many on the call will have already submitted views to DFAT and to DIT, but we continue to be very interested in getting your feedback, particularly on trade frictions you've experienced or worthwhile economic opportunities that are not currently available to you, as in the case of Australian businesses, as Australian service suppliers or investors. So this will assist us in structuring our market access requests and ensure that we focus these final months on commercially meaningful outcomes. And I'm sure the UK is, Ben is in the same camp as in being very keen to get your views on these things. So please be in touch with us. I look forward to the rest of the discussion and pick back up at the end if we can.
Stephen, thank you so much for the outline there. I mean, this is great. I have so many questions, but I have to restrain myself of the temptation of asking, because we indeed have representatives from financial sector, professional sector, higher education, who may well have specific concerns that they may want to air before the agreement is finally signed. So what I suggest, because we have 6 speakers, I would suggest emphasize what is from your sector the main concern you want or the main question you want the negotiators to take in mind in this process from the AIP to the final signature of the agreement to take in mind. So that would be if you can, focus on that message, that would be great. So we have, 5 minutes each. We start with John Cook, who is a consultant to the City UK of international trade and investment policy issues, and acts as chairman of the City UK Liberalisation of Trading Services Committee. John, please.
Gabriel, thank you very much indeed. And my thanks to Queen Mary University of London and to all the other organisers for inviting me to this webinar. The City UK represents UK-based financial and related professional services. So that's the point from which I shall be coming in what I have to say. We very much welcome this agreement. It's of course in some ways an oddity amongst free trade agreements, because it's between two parties that are very far apart geographically and and where there are already low tariffs. But it does have a much wider significance in terms of being, as other speakers have said, the first of its kind and representing the UK tilt towards Asia Pacific markets. There's also going to be an agreement with New Zealand. It's also significant from the point of view of the UK's progress, we hope, to joining the CPTPP. All these are important surrounding aspects for the agreement. Now, turning to financial and related professional services in particular, we of course are enormously interested in improved market access and greater competition in the two markets. In financial services, there's actually a broad trade balance, except that insurance is very much asymmetric. And this is an opportunity to address a number of rather specific barriers, and also to address the question of regulatory coherence. And I'm delighted that the speakers so far have referred to that. For related professional services, we fully agree that mutual recognition of professional qualifications, mobility, and conditions of stay for business visitors and service suppliers are all going to be important features for us in this negotiation. Likewise, on digital trade, we welcomed the announcement that there will be cutting-edge provisions. We will be interested in how far these cohere with the UK-Japan CEPA, and also the prospects for the provisions of the existing digital economy agreements that Australia has and the UK aspires to. These again are going to be important questions. We welcome the general impression that has been conveyed in the agreement in principle, but it will of course be good to see the details, because for services the devil is always in the detail. Just to say a little more on our objectives, we certainly endorse the UK Department of International Trade's UK-Australia FTA strategic approach, and we very much would emphasize that any FTA needs to be a living agreement as far as it can be, and run in parallel with regulatory cooperation. For services, those are absolutely essential issues. There has recently been a published report from the Corporation of the City of London on areas of regulatory cooperation. These included the Australian licensing regime for UK financial services businesses operating on behalf of wholesale clients, asset management, permitted activities, banking, where there are some restrictions on UK banks compared with in other jurisdictions, payments, where there are some licensing issues that we would like to have cleared up, and fintech, whereas, as already been said, there's an opportunity to extend all the concepts and practices of the fintech bridge. In professional and legal services, we shall greatly welcome mutual market access and recognition of professional qualifications. That goes without saying. Terms for visiting each other's countries in terms of fly in, fly out, and other facilities for practitioners will be important. We welcome the emphasis that there clearly is on people movement. That's going to be an extremely significant issue for our sector. We note that at the moment there have been some problems for UK practitioners under the Australia temporary skills shortage structure of provisions. It will be very good if those can be cleared up. And all this, of course, is of importance to us because Australia is, apart from anything else, a member of the CPTPP, and will be keenly interested in whether the provisions measure up to or even exceed the CPTPP provisions. So those are really a very quick sketch of the issues that will be important for my industry. And I hugely look forward to hearing how the final provisions of this agreement turn out after negotiations, which I judge will still have a little way to go over July, August, and maybe the autumn before all of those provisions are nailed down. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Certainly a long to-do list. So for our government officials, colleagues here present today. So now let me turn to James Bond, who is head of government affairs for Australia and New Zealand at City and president of the Australian Services Roundtable. James, please.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Let me first start by talking about the Australian Services Roundtable. We started as a group of companies in Australia about 20 years ago to force services to be higher in the agenda in Australian free trade agreement negotiations. And we succeeded in that. The fact that we're having this video conference is an indication of that. But over the past few years, what we've coalesced around is the issue of digital trade. And all the members all have pointed in the direction of this is the issue that we need to deal with. And Australian negotiators have come to the party and done an excellent job, I think. And the UK Australia FTA, as has been announced so far, certainly does that. And I want to thank Elizabeth Bowes, who's not on the call, but was on the last one, who's the Chief Australian Negotiator, for that, but also Stephen Dietz and Ben Rake for what's been achieved so far. It is fantastic. I want to talk about not so much the list for what we need to happen in the negotiation, because I think I want to talk about what's next. Where does this agreement point us, and how does it get implemented? And what are some of the concerns? So on financial services, I think we do need some detail before we can really comment on that. But I'm impressed with the investment part of the agreement so far. And I think there's a lot more opportunities for both countries in financial services. Our intergenerational report came out this week, which gives an indication of how the economy is going to be tracking in 2061. And some data for you: our private pension system, superannuation, will be 244% of GDP by then, and will be 14, and that will compare to the Australian Stock Exchange of $14 trillion. So that means that a lot of investment has to take place from Australian superannuation fund members, and that has to take place in some countries, and someone needs to facilitate that investment. So there's huge opportunities there. I want to sound my first warning, and that is on implementation, and that is, it's great to see references to regulatory cooperation, but in the past, when Australia has had these clauses in free trade agreements, the regulators have not come to the party. They need to actually fully resource that area and make sure that they actually do some of that regulatory harmonisation. Moving on to the other issue that's important for ASR, Australian Services Roundtable, that's digital trade. So we're very pleased with the clauses on cross-border data flows. Now, in the Asia-Pacific region, there's some countries that are building barriers to the free flow of data across borders. For example, mandating data be kept onshore. And these countries, I'm talking about Vietnam, possibly Indonesia, possibly India. And that's to put it in trade terms, these barriers to the free flow of data are the tariffs and quotas of the 21st century. And we need to make sure that they don't take place. And that's why this agreement's so good. And that's my first point is that, that this agreement, through these really strong clauses, allowing the free flow of data cross-border, adds to the network of such agreements, Singapore, Australia, DEA, there's quite a few others around, and leads us, I think, towards a regional digital economy agreement and potentially improvements to CPTPP. The second point is that I think this agreement hopefully pushes the EU towards doing something similar. And I think that pressure is already starting to become apparent in some of the movements in some of the other agreements it's had. But again, I want to sound a note of warning, and that is that governments often use national security as an excuse to prevent the free flow of data across borders. And Australia, for example, is currently drafting legislation on critical infrastructure, and we need to be vigilant that this isn't used as an excuse within the free trade agreement, because national security issues are a factor that can be used, that this isn't used inappropriately to stop the free flow of data across borders. And that means that our economic bureaucrats need to be in touch with our defence and national security bureaucrats. So coming across a bit negative there, so let me be positive again. We're really happy with the way it's turned out so far, and we're really looking forward to the final agreement. And thanks so much for the work that's been done so far by both sides.
James, thank you very much. In your case, it's more like not that much a to-do list, but warnings about the future. And indeed, I mean, the signature of the agreement may be the end of the work for the negotiators, but it's just a beginning. You know, it's all about implementation to make sure these institutional frameworks that are created by the agreement function in practice and are duly resourced, and we do not over-abuse about the flexibilities embedded in the agreement. So thank you for those comments. So now I turn to George Reidel, who is Director for Trade Strategy at Ernst & Young in London and also acts as Secretariat for the UK Professional and Business Services Council. So George, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gabrielle, and to echo my thanks to both Queen Mary University and also the government colleagues who have come and given the presentation today. So given in the interest of time, and I know we have a couple more speakers, I'll not sort of repeat John's list of areas that, you know, the UK services industry would like to see resolved as part of the agreement, rather pick up on a couple of the points that James made around implementation. And I think, you know, implementation is going to be so crucial to this, not just in the financial services cooperation, although, you know, that is key, but across all of the regular committees that will be established as part of the agreement that are relevant to the services industry. In particular, you know, that new innovation chapter, a lot of the value of that chapter will be the Australian and UK governments with private sector input really coming together on a regular basis, putting the resources in, time, effort, in order to make it something meaningful rather than just a bit of text that's agreed in a bilateral treaty between the two countries. And the same goes for things like mutual recognition of professional qualifications and some of the elements of digital trade as well, because we know that the emerging standards for those are going to change continuously. over the coming years. We're not in a sort of static situation when it comes to the regulation of the digital economy. So it will need to be updated. We will need to see further facilitations. And unless both sides are putting in that sort of continued and sustained effort, the value of the agreement could be so much more than just, as I said, on a bit of paper. Linked to the implementation question as well, I think it's also around communication. So for big firms, they have the capacity to, you know, read a trade agreement, interpret what it means, look at that market access, and then take advantage of it. For small and medium-sized firms, that's much more difficult. So I think there is an education piece to be done once the agreement comes into force as to how companies on both sides in the UK and Australia can actually take advantage of that new market access that's being negotiated and sort of the rules facilitating trade between the two countries. My final point, and again, it's something that James mentioned, it is this regional question. With the UK launching negotiations with Singapore on digital trade last week, 2 weeks ago, and Australia having that digital trade agreement with Singapore, you know, I think there's a real opportunity to make sure that, excuse me, that these agreements work together and are complementary, rather than creating, you know, a new spaghetti bowl of rules and regulations that companies who are looking to operate regionally have to navigate. So I think keeping that sort of synergies at the forefront of the negotiators' minds as the talks proceed, I think will be important and have real value to businesses as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, George. Indeed, difficulty, again, warning about implementation. Mutual recognition of professional qualifications is very encouraging, but it's very nitty-gritty and troublesome to get in practice. So appreciate any efforts to make this come into being. Communicating to SMEs is important to make sure they make the most of the opportunities creating of the agreement. And in terms of avoiding spaghetti bowls, I would, you know, pass on if there's time to comment on the most favored nation provision, how this agreement, the commitments in this agreement are going to, you know, extend it to other future benefits or not. So let me, if you don't mind, I have Jane now, but if you don't mind, Jane, given the fact that you have discussed before, and let's pass on, give the opportunity to those who have not spoken yet. And so let me pass on the floor to John Richardson from Cox. So John has been a director of Cox since 1973. Throughout this time, John has been project director for many of the practice's most notable local and international projects in more than 20 countries. With extensive experience, he has led teams on over 30 award-winning projects. So hands-on experience on providing architectural services at the international level. So John, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gabriel, and thank everybody for putting all this together. Now my notes are confused because issues have been raised that I hadn't thought about. Just to put me in some frame here, I have been involved with the Australian Services Roundtable since its inception. And as James said, our challenge initially was to encourage government to take services seriously because we were and still are employing 80–85% of Australians. And but we were not really on the trade radar at all. That has changed for the better, but the amount of trade is still poor, relatively speaking. We provide our services. We are not a firm that is all over the world. We provide our services from Australia into other countries. So that's the sort of experience we have. We have rarely established businesses outside Australia. We've had some in the Middle East. We've had one in Singapore for a while, and also one that we've been looking at establishing in New Zealand. Just to go through a few points, the accreditation or mutual recognition is important. But it's an interesting twist, because in Australia, you don't have to be a registered architect to design a building. So what it entitles you to do is call yourself an architect to distinguish you from somebody else designing a building. However, there are some exceptions, and this is the complication. There are some exceptions to that. So, for example, in New South Wales, the state that I reside in, you have to be a registered architect to design certain apartment buildings. Partly the reason for that is witnessed probably in Miami at the moment. So but it's a sort of twist. And what we're seeing is because of these sorts of events, we're starting to see a growth in regulation in our architectural world, which is kind of new to us. And so I don't know what the impact of that is going to be on the free trade negotiations, Steve and Ben, but it's starting to emerge that we're seeing more regulation in our area, which could complicate things. And as you know, it's already complicated a little bit, mutual recognition between states in the first place, because we're a federation. I think the objective for mutual recognition would really be to aim for the arrangement I think we have with New Zealand. New Zealand recognises our qualifications, and basically you can become registered in New Zealand if a New Zealand architect or 2 or 3 are referees for you. So that, I think, would be a target in terms of mutual recognition for architects. One of the complications for us practicing anywhere is insurance, and I've heard no discussion about that. We've just completed a significant project in France and at Villers-Bretonneux, and we delivered. That was a very complicated arrangement in the EU, and in particular in France, which demonstrated to us that the EU was not a total simple package. It's actually much more complicated than that. And so the way that buildings are delivered in France is very different from the way that they're delivered in Australia. The relationship between the architect and the contractors is very different in France. And it complicated our insurance in terms of our professional indemnity insurance. So it's those sorts of things. Somebody mentioned earlier that the devil is in the detail in services. It certainly is in professional services. So I think we just need to focus on changes in regulation. We need to be wary of that, increasing regulation. We need to look at what protection we actually can achieve in each other's neighbourhoods. On mobility of services, that's really important for us as well. Pre-COVID, we have always relied, quite frankly, on a supply of wonderful architects from the UK. And what we're experiencing, and not just the UK, of course, from Europe and South America and Asia and all over the world, people coming to Sydney and working. But we're experiencing a very interesting problem at the moment in Sydney, because just notwithstanding this COVID event, the market is very hot. But no one's coming into the country to feed us, to feed our resources. So suddenly we're faced with a new sort of pressure, which we haven't seen for a long time. For example, we're seeing pressure on wages. So there's an incredible dynamic going on in the economy here today. And I think I might leave it there. I like the idea of exchange programs, and we would be very encouraging of doing that with architects flowing between the UK and Australia and back again. That would be, I think, of great benefit.
John,
But I think I'll leave it there, Gabriel.
thank you so much, John. So much real life, hands-on experience of barriers affecting the international delivery of architectural services. And these amber lights that are turning on at regulatory level, and the challenges of managing regulation at federal and state level are certainly a difficult task for negotiators. So thank you for highlighting that so much. So now we turn on to the higher education sector, one that is closer to my heart. And I pass the floor to Stephanie Harris, who is Head of International Engagement on EU at Universities UK International, which is the voice of UK universities. Stephanie, thank you for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Gabrielle, and thanks so much for the invite. I think, you know, in the UK, the higher education sector is a bit of a services industry that can sometimes fly under the radar when it comes to trade negotiations, although I should say that we as a body and as a sector have probably learned an awful lot from our Australian colleagues in terms of the way that they approach higher education within their own trade negotiations. I'm aware of time, so I'll be brief. I guess the first thing I want to say is that we would clearly agree with much of what has already been said. Whilst, you know, for the higher education sector, it's good to see the kind of liberalisation approach being taken towards services. Education services is actually one of those things that we would hope and expect to appear on the negative list approach, and I think ourselves, you know, feel that perhaps the China-Australia FTA provides a useful kind of definition of how you take that approach to education services. Like others, we really welcome the commitment on mutual recognition of professional qualifications, and clearly key to making sure that graduates from UK universities are able to work and work successfully in Australia and vice versa. On mobility, again, welcome much of what has been set out. I think that the two key things I would pick out in particular as important for the higher education sector would be around the youth mobility scheme and seeing that expanded. Clearly, that's again a great way for graduates, Australian graduates from UK universities to stay and work in the UK and post-qualification and vice versa, and with kind of less regulation and less kind of compliance issues than perhaps traditional post-study work routes, both in the UK and in Australia. The second one I wanted to pick out was that innovation and early careers skills exchange, and I think we're really excited to see what that looks like and see how that mobility scheme develops. We'd be really keen that it does facilitate kind of mobility for early career researchers in particular between the UK and Australia, to kind of strengthen research collaboration between the two nations through the movement of people. And then lastly, I guess the thing I wanted to highlight was the innovation chapter, which we think is clearly incredibly interesting, a world first, and the commitment to create a strategic innovation dialogue there is really great to see. I guess two things there, and one of which echoes what has already been said. I guess the kind of devil is in the detail in terms of implementation and what that looks like. I think specifically for the higher education sector, the point I would make is that it's really important not to get kind of universities within the ecosystem of that innovation ecosystem, and to make sure that the kind of beginning of the pipeline as well as the rest of the pipeline is included within that dialogue and whatever comes. In conversations that we had with members, one of the kind of key barriers that they highlighted to us in terms of collaboration with Australia was the kind of lack of joint research funding. And again, anything that dialogue and structures created beneath it can do to make sure that research, bilateral research funding between the UK and Australia is more easy to come by, would be really welcomed by us and our members. But I'll leave it there, Gabrielle.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Indeed, there are very promising features on innovation and mobility, which are quite relevant for the higher education sector, but pretty much will depend on how this is implemented in practice. So thank you for highlighting this. So I will quickly turn to Jane before I ask for some feedback from the government negotiators or government officials. So Jane, please. Jane Drake Brockman is industry professor with the Institute for International Trade and Jean Monnet Network Director, Trade and Investment Services Associates, and she's also the founder and director of the Australian Services Roundtable. So your thoughts, Jane?
Thank you, Gabriel. It really isn't necessary for me to say much, and we must give time to the two government speakers, but I just emphasise that this really is an agreement of a quite historic nature, to the extent that we've been told what's going to be in this agreement. I have to say it's a gold standard precedent-setting set of outcomes across many services sectors. To have a negative list of services commitments, to have a ratchet clause, to have an MFN forward clause, to have our best FTA market access. I mean, even hopefully that means more than what 20 years ago we offered each other in the Doha round. I would hope it does. But it's clearly Australia's most ambitious agreement on investment market access. It has many remarkable features, including the UK-driven chapter on trade and gender, and with 91% of Australian women employed in the services sector. Someone has to say it. If you want to do something about trade in women, you start with the services sector. So for me, the economics of this FTA are just abundantly self-evident, with the extent of dominance of services in both of our economies, both GDP and employment. You're ahead of us. The UK is ahead of us on the trade side, and we have much to learn. And I think that the chapters on regulatory best practice and innovation are going to help future-proof that ongoing dialogue. This is a high point for services, and in terms of what do we want and must reinforce with our negotiators, we look to both governments to complete the job, and in particular on digital trade, to improve our interoperability on every front, and then it's over to industry to link up. And you can see today we are linking up, we are communicating with each other, and we will be intensifying all of our efforts with our counterparts in the UK.
Thank you so much, Jane. So before we wrap up, we had a lot of requests, warnings, praise, as well, a combination of all of these. So I will give our government official representatives a couple of minutes to react to this, if they don't mind. And I will start now with Steve in this case. Any reactions, Steve, from our services industry stakeholders?
Thank you. I mean, with only a minute or two, I would note, I mean, the requests, warnings and praise is all very well noted. I mean, the UK is our third largest services trading partner. It's a huge market for us, and it has been a focus throughout these negotiations. And we take in particular, I know, the forward-looking aspect of the negotiations post-entry into force and the implementation side very seriously, as we've grown our FTA coverage of international trade. I think we're at 70% of our trade now is covered by free trade agreements. We've done our best as a government to improve utilisation and the ability of our SMEs to utilise the agreements, both in the provisions they contain and the communications afterwards, and the resources that go into maintaining those agreements. So that's definitely going to be a focus. And just one more point, because I didn't have time to mention it at the beginning, which is in relation to CPTPP. Of course, Australia is hugely enthusiastic about the UK's request to accede, and that will keep the conversations going between us as we move through the bilateral process as well. So it's useful to have that broader UK engagement in the Indo-Pacific and maintaining those high rules and standards that are enshrined in the CPTPP alongside the work that we're doing bilaterally. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Ben, any final comments from you?
Thank you. I'll be really brief. Agree with all of that, Stephen. So firstly, just say thank you. This is really important and really welcome, and it's always great to hear from stakeholders. I always enjoy it, and I've enjoyed this. So thank you very much. Please keep talking to us. Completely agree on implementation, I mean, I think as Stephen said, there is a lot in the agreement that makes this not only future-proof, but kind of living. It's incumbent on us to keep up that dialogue and to keep up those relationships. I can't think of two better countries to do that, frankly, than the UK and Australia. So I hope that not only does this deliver benefits as it comes into force, but also supports that longer term trade and investment relationship between the UK and Australia. The other thing I just want to very quickly touch on was something James said actually about the protectionism on data. I would just say more generally, like, I think we are in a time where open markets, free trade, non-discrimination is not necessarily a given, and actually the chance to do a big comprehensive gold standard FTA that we've all been talking about in between our two countries, and the message that will send in whether it's Indo-Pacific or to the EU shouldn't be underestimated. And I think it's a really important part of it. So thank you, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you, to all the participants for sharing your time today, valuable insights, and making my task as moderator very easy, because you've been very disciplined in sticking to your time. I want to congratulate those involved in the negotiations and wish them well for the legal scrubbing process that lies ahead. And I also want to thank our business discussants for bringing the sectoral perspectives to the table and helping us link the debate to the actual needs and expectations of the industry. And finally, I want to thank the events teams at Queen Mary, in particular to Christine Stokes, for helping us in setting up this event at a very short notice. So thank you, everyone, and stay tuned. Let's keep future events again. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.